In this video, I'm going to be explaining how to take apart, clean, and then reassemble my 1990 Suzuki Katana carburetors. The first thing you'll notice is that my carburetors are painted. You don't want to do this because you're going to scratch it up and gasoline will eat it away. So just never paint your carburetors. I'm also using an ultrasonic cleaner to clean my carburetors. I can explain how to do it without one as well, but I highly recommend you use an ultrasonic cleaner because it just cleans all the crevices that you can't always get to. Be delicate when taking apart your carburetors and putting them back together. There's a few parts that are very prone to breaking if you're not careful, and I'll be trying to go over every single one of those that I can as well. I also have a book for taking apart my carburetors. As you can see over here, there's a parts diagram, and over here there's specifications for a lot of the different parts. Up here it shows the different kinds of carburetors, and all this is the different specifications for all the different parts. When reassembling your carburetors, you're also going to want to sync them. That means they're all putting out the same amount of gas and air, as in not the fuel air mixture, but they're all equal. What I'm going to be doing in this video is bench syncing the carburetors. That means putting them together and essentially eyeballing them without the need of extra tools. It gets it pretty close, but you're going to want to sync them properly as well. You'll also want to tune your fuel air mixture. To do that, there's just a screw under here for each one of these. It's called your pilot screw, and generally you want it between 2 and 3 turns. Any more and any less, you should have a problem going on. That being said, if you get your fuel air mixture to be correct, it still works, right? To get started, we're first going to be removing this over here. It's called your starter shaft lever. To do that, all you have to do is pull out these little plastic pieces from over here, which I've already done. Now you want to remove your idle cable from these parts right here, and then we're going to start removing all of these screws. Once you've removed that, now we're going to start removing all these screws. Once you've removed those screws, it can come apart nice and easy. Now you're just going to want to remove the hoses that are attached to it, just so we can start working on it. As you can see, I've still got my throttle cable attached, and I got a really weird thing on it. This over here allows it to still spin freely, which you want it to do, and it's because this part originally broke, and I had to create something so that it would actually hold on to it. I already forgot to mention something earlier. What you're going to want to do is drain your carburetors. To do that, all you have to do is loosen up this screw right over here, and this hole in the bottom will let the gasoline leak out. You want to do this before you start messing around with the carburetor, flipping it upside down and everything, because you're going to have just gas going all over the place. Generally, your drain screw will be on really tight, and in order to not strip it, I like to use a pair of these first, just to loosen it up so I don't strip it with a normal Phillips head. Another small detail you'll notice is this over here. Originally, my carburetor had a crack in it, and I had to fill in the crack so I didn't have fuel coming out. There are a variety of different materials you can use to do this. I can't remember exactly what I used, but this over here will work just fine. It's something I picked up at AutoZone a while back. When taking apart these carburetors, they're all relatively the same. There's only one major distinction between them, and that's your main jet. The main jet looks the same, but it's slightly different in the number 3 carburetor. That's because the number 3 carburetor has a slightly larger bore than all the others. So when reassembling it, you want to make sure that carb has that jet. When looking at my book, you can see the distinction right here. Number 3 uses 110, and the other ones use 105. We're going to start off by removing the top of the carburetor, this big plastic thing right over here. Keep in mind, if you decide to go straight to the bowls and remove the bowls first, this piece over here in the corner is plastic underneath. It's very delicate and easy to break, so don't be hitting it on anything. Ignore that number 4 right over there, it's mislabeled. But first we're going to be taking off these 2 screws. Once you pull it off, you should have it looking just like this. Keep in mind there's a small little O-ring right here and you don't want to lose it. Now we're going to be pulling this piece out, and keep in mind there's a few parts underneath inside of there. These are the parts I was talking about. The top is called the spring seat, right beneath it is the metal E-ring, and below that is the washer. And the actual needle itself is just the jet needle. Now that we're done messing with the top of it, we're going to flip it over and start removing the carburetor bowl. Like I've said before, if these are too tight, instead of stripping them, use something like this to loosen it up first. Now that I've loosened it all up, let's remove it, and keep in mind, There's a small gasket, as you can see, attached to it. Now we're just going to pull out the float, nice and easy. Now don't lose this little rubber piece right here. It's very small and easy to lose. As you can see, I just pulled it out. Now we're going to be removing the main jet right over here. This is another part where if it's too tight, use one of these to remove it instead of stripping it. You're also going to want to keep in mind that if it's dirty, do not shove anything down there. It's a very specific bore diameter, and if you stuff anything down there, you're going to mess up that diameter. You're going to want to use chemicals or anything to clean it other than shoving something down it. Don't forget that this is also the main jet I was talking about earlier, where the number 3 one has a slightly larger bore. Now let's remove the pilot screw right over here. When you remove this part, you're going to want to keep in mind all these little pieces. This is the correct order you put it back together. And you're also going to want to make sure this tip over here is still nice and pointy. If it's damaged or dull, you're going to have to replace it. Now let's remove part of the choke. This right over here is part of the choke, and you're going to want to flip it over and just pull out this little piece of plastic. This is what that assembly should look like that you just pulled out. Now keep in mind there's a few parts on here that it looks like you can remove them, but you just don't want to. As you can see, these over here, they have little flat heads on them. However, I do not recommend you pull them out. If you have to clean them, I recommend using an ultrasonic cleaner or carburetor cleaner by shooting it straight through there. However, you can remove this one over here. It's called your pilot jet. Be very careful when removing it so you don't strip it. The last part I'm going to be removing for the sake of this video is this over here. Keep in mind that even with a clean carburetor, it can be in incredibly tight. You can also notice a small amount of cracking in the corners over here, so keep in mind that it is very easy to break this piece. How I loosened it up was simply by putting my thumb in there and just pulling it out. It may also be holding inside of here. What I like to do to loosen it up is put a very small Phillips head inside of here to actually push the piece out. However, if it is in very tight, do not do this. You could damage the threads on accident. Once you've managed to pull it out, this is what it should look like. There's one little part I forgot to mention, this over here. All you gotta do is pull this off from here. As you can see, I've already started to remove the paint from my carburetors. It's a real pain to do it, so just don't paint it in the first place. You might also notice this over here. Originally, the part underneath started to rust, and as I was removing the rust, I noticed it began to leak if I put fluid on the other side. So I decided to fill it in with some JB Weld just to prevent this. There's one more part left in the carburetors that I'm not going to remove. That's the butterfly valves right over here. These 2 screws are next to impossible for me to remove. It'd probably be a lot easier just to drill them out and replace the screws. If your butterfly valves are getting stuck or seized, I'm going to have to recommend you take them apart or just spend a long time trying to clean out all the ports on the side, right along here and along here. I read online where someone used Seafoam Deep Creep to do it. They said it took 3 hours just to unseize them, so you're going to have to take your time, unfortunately. If you're lucky, you might just be able to unseize them with carburetor cleaner or an ultrasonic cleaner. I also found a video online where someone put their carburetor into boiling water. This was able to unseize their butterfly valves. With that in mind, I haven't dealt with butterfly valves being seized before, so you're probably going to have to look at another source for this kind of information. Now that everything's taken apart, it's time to clean it. I recommend you use a combination of gasoline, carburetor cleaner, and a toothbrush. You're going to want to go over every single part meticulously, and I also recommend that you try blowing air and carburetor cleaner through all the different ports inside of here. Once you're confident that your carburetor is clean, I recommend that you drop it into an ultrasonic cleaner. This just is the extra step that makes your carburetors perfectly clean. Something I feel I should mention is that you should probably be wearing glasses when you're cleaning your carburetors. If you're using carburetor cleaner, it comes out at a high pressure, and if it gets in your eyes, you're really going to regret it. I just decided to take apart the floats real quick. These are the parts in it, and as you can see, the O-rings on here, you're going to want to make sure they're in decent condition, and this piece right over here is what stops the gas from continuing to flow into the carburetor bowls. You're going to want to make sure it's in decent condition. If your floats themselves are damaged, meaning they have like a hole or something in them, you're probably just going to want to replace them. Some people try to repair them, but at the end of the day, this is plastic and it's really hard to get perfection when you're trying to fix plastic. You're also going to want to check the condition of these hoses, make sure they're not collapsing in on themselves and starving it from fuel. Also make sure that both of these are still in good condition. Same goes with over here. Sometimes the rubber on this can get really old and damaged. There are certain ways you can repair them, but generally just replacing them if they've got a cut in them is the way to go. You're going to want to go over all the rubber pieces again just to make sure they're all in good condition. You don't want to put something back in and then realize you have a small leak somewhere. Another small detail you're going to want to keep in mind is this metal tab. You adjust this according to your float height. If it's too bent, however, in the sense that it's too malleable, you might have to replace it because simply your float height is not going to be exactly what you set it to, and it's going to keep bending when you put it back inside your carburetor. Now that I think I've covered everything, I'm going to start putting everything back together. Keep in mind that if there's any differences on here that I think are noteworthy, after I reassemble this, I'll mention those. Now we're going to put all this back inside, and you want to keep in mind that this port right here is visible from this side of the carburetor. Now that that's back together, we're going to install the main jet in the bottom right over here. Now we can reinstall the pilot jet right over here. Install the pilot screw right over here. Don't forget all these little pieces that are on it. To install this part correctly, it's going to be very bike specific, in the sense that your bike is going to have a slightly different fuel air mixture than mine. What you want to do is tighten it all the way, but do not over tighten it because then you're just going to break the needle, and then you're going to want to slightly back it out between 2 and 3 turns. I recommend you keep in mind when you first remove it the exact position so you can just put it right back where you originally had it. Now you're going to want to put this little rubber piece right back here. Now you put the float back in, and I'm going to adjust the float height right now. Your float height, there's a few steps that you have to take. First of all, you're going to want to make sure the O-rings that are over here and over here are all the way seated in. The next step is you're going to put it on its side like this and slowly bring it up until it finds the point where it stops. Since I only have 2 hands, I can't show everything perfectly on camera. However, once you get it to that point, you're going to want it to rest right there. Then you're going to measure the height all the way from the top to the base right over here. The specific height from the center right over here to right down here is going to be your float height. If you want, you can purchase a tool that's specifically designed for measuring float height. Me, however, I'm just going to be using this right over here. The specific height you want your float to be at, well, I've gotten a lot of different responses to that. People have told me between 14.6 and 15. That's the general assumption. I have, however, had people tell me much lower, and I'm just going to recommend 14.6 with a margin of error of 0.5 millimeters. While my book does also say 14.6, it says the margin of error is 1 millimeter. I'm going to say that's way too much. I found a lot of other problems in the book, and this wouldn't be the first one. If your float height is off, you're going to want to bend this tab right under here. Bending that tab will allow this to either set higher or set lower. I'll try to find a video better explaining how to set your float height, and I'll put it in the video description. Now we're going to reinstall this piece over here. Keep in mind it's helpful to reinstall this section first because this over here is very delicate, and when reinstalling this, you could accidentally break this if you have this installed first. Now I'm going to reinstall these 2 screws with lock washers on them. Keep in mind that if you don't have lock washers, or this thing is just prone to coming loose, you might want to put a small amount of really weak Loctite on there because you might have to take it apart again someday. Thread block blue says medium strength, but I find it to be very decent. It's not too hard in my opinion, so if you need to, feel free to put it right here. Now with the carburetor flipped back over, we can install this piece over here. It's helpful if you put the needle and the washers in first. When you're finally putting this cap back on, make sure that the rubber is sealing all the way around in these grooves. If it's old, it can be harder to do this. Now I'm going to put this little O-ring right back over here and then drop this spring right into the center. Now we can reinstall this piece over here with this part right here going right over this O-ring. Now we're almost done. Let's put this piece right here and then this on top of it right over here. Now we can reinstall this choke piece right over here. Keep in mind you really want this to be clean. I've had a lot of problems with my choke seizing up, and I got a feeling you might have the same thing going on. I've also heard people recommend putting machine oil in here. That's very, very thin oil that helps lubricate it. Now that you have the piece back in, give it a few tugs and make sure that it can actually move nice and freely. Now your carburetor should be clean and back together. I'm going to move on to cleaning these and removing all the paint from them, and then afterwards I'm going to show you guys how to put everything back together. If you ended up having the same problem as me, I'm going to go over this in slight detail. This is essentially just a piece of metal I cut up. I put threads in it as well so it really holds it, and I put a decent amount of Loctite on it. I also painted it because it's steel, and steel just rusts super quickly. You're going to want to make sure when you install this that this piece on the side is still long enough to where this cable can still move freely and the part can actually spin. I also just noticed that the material that was holding my pipes in was messed up and that it was all falling apart and disappearing. So I decided to fill in all the sides of where the pipes are just with the same material I mentioned earlier. It's excessive, it's unnecessary, but it's something I felt like doing because why not? I just finished filming and I realized I forgot to attach these hoses. So I'm going to take it apart and put it in, but just keep in mind everything after this part of the video, the hoses aren't attached. So it's something small, but just don't forget the hoses. When installing these hoses, you're going to want to make sure the tips of them, like this especially, doesn't get caught up and kind of smushed in a way that it prevents fuel from flowing through it. It's very easy to do that, so just be very careful when installing them. When you're installing these hoses, you're going to want to keep in mind that this longer fuel hose goes on this side of the bike. And you're also going to want to keep in mind this clamp over here. I have it set up in a way where the clamp is on that side. You want to do this so that it doesn't interfere with the airbox when you're installing that later. On a side note, I have two other videos, one explaining how to properly route all the hoses on your Suzuki Katana, and another one explaining how to properly install an airbox. I'd keep that in mind if you're having any air leaks. That's a pretty common thing where people will mistake how to properly install their airbox and they'll have an air leak coming from there. So I now have both of these hoses in on both sides, and you want to pay attention to this clamp as well because it also fits right inside of the carb area as well. Now we're going to start putting everything back together. The first thing you're going to want to do is get these springs attached. All you have to do that is make sure that the lever is on top of the spring. That being that the screw over here pushes on the lever itself instead of seating the spring. You're also going to want to install your throttle cable before you throw the rest of the carb on. The reason for this is just because the part that it mounts to right over here is very delicate. As you can see, mine's already broken and replaced, and you're just going to want to do that first. If you're having trouble installing your springs, I'm going to recommend you loosen up this screw over here. We're going to be messing with this screw later when bench sinking it. As you can see, I also have my idle cable removed for this entire process. We're going to start by installing this bottom bracket, and you're going to want to keep in mind this piece over here, it's a slightly longer screw than the others. The same goes for this one over here. I also like to use a weaker kind of thread lock for this, just because I've had experience with these starting to come out over time. I also find it easier to install just one of them at a time. It just makes it a little bit easier when trying to line them up properly. Now that we have all of this on, let's flip it over and put on the other bracket. The last thing you want to know about the hoses is that this fuel line does go behind this just like this. You don't want to try to route it underneath or you're going to squeeze the fuel line and you're going to have problems. So I just started to put these on and I put a small amount of thread lock just like the other side. Now I'm going to tighten it down and move on to the next part. Now we're going to be installing this, and make sure you don't bend it in the process. If you do bend it, your choke's not going to move very freely and you're going to have some problems with it. All you have to do to install it is make sure that the bottom piece under there hooks up in every single spot, and then just push these 3 pieces in. Another small detail is these little plastic pieces. You want to assemble them exactly how I have them. It's easier to install this one the other direction. However, this little knob right here is actually going to start pushing it out if you have it installed the other way, which is easier to install, ironically enough. Now we're going to move on to installing the idle screw right over here. Now comes an annoying part. We're going to be bench syncing these carburetors so that they're ready to be synced properly. How to start bench syncing is you're going to first start with this cable over here, your idle screw. You're going to be wanting to turn it in until you have this carburetor over here at a very, it doesn't have to be too specific, but you see those 3 dots in there at the very bottom? You want those 3 dots to be at a very noticeable angle so that you can get all of these to be the exact same angle as this one. You're not going to be able to get it at the perfect idle right now because that's not what you're aiming for. All you want to do is make sure that all of these are open the exact same amount. Later, when you're adjusting your idle, you're going to want it to be between 1100 to 1300 RPM, and you're only going to want to do this after the bike is warmed up. You also do not want choke to be applied when you're adjusting your idle. To adjust the sync of your carburetors, what you're going to want to do is turn in these screws to a specific amount so that all of them are the exact same angle. You're going to want to start with the one on the far left and then move to this one and then this one. You want to keep in mind that this is the benchmark. This is the one that you're trying to imitate everything after. So keep in mind also that this relies on this one. So you're going to have to adjust this one before you adjust this one. After you've managed to get them all to about the same level, you're going to want to grab your throttle cable, pull on it, and then let it go. Once you do that, it essentially just drops everything so it is able to reseat in a slightly better position. You're going to want to do this multiple times so that it seats in a more reliable and consistent position. After that, you could then want to resync everything again. When I'm syncing them, I generally like to adjust the idle screw just to get a different perspective when trying to sync all of them. I like to lower it generally and put it between the top and the bottom 2 circles. That just gives it a pretty accurate measurement. At the end of the day, however, you can't expect to be perfect when adjusting this on your bench. You're going to want to have an actual bench sync kit and a good one as well. A lot of the kits online are essentially worse than a bench sync, so sometimes you might just want to outsource it and go to a mechanic. Now your carburetors are fully assembled and ready to be installed. If I've made any mistakes in this video, I'll gladly take the video down and re-upload it with the correct information. I'm also going to be uploading a engine reassembly and then how to install it back onto your bike, along with how to adjust your valves, because I'm going to be doing that in the process. So keep in tune to the channel if you'd like. I'm going to be covering as many details as I can, essentially, to help out the next guy.